I'm Michael Bordeaux. I'm chairing this session. Charles Plosser was supposed to chair it, and he couldn't make it. He had health issues, and he's very sorry that he couldn't come. And I suspect had he been here, he would have had some incredible words to say at the beginning. So I will just be a very imperfect substitute for Charlie. I also want to say something about Marvin, which no one else has said yet. I've known Marvin a long time, I guess his whole career, and I just wanted to mention that in addition to being this brilliant monetary economist, Marvin's also a fantastic economic historian. And last night some of that work was mentioned, but actually way back when, it was like 87, he wrote a paper on the classical gold standard. He applied Bob Lucas's asset pricing theory to the gold standard, and I was a discussant. This was at Carnegie Rochester. And I must say, it was an absolutely brilliant paper, and no one's ever done anything. He did it, and it had brilliant insights, and then he went on and didn't talk about it anymore. But I just want to say we got to add to his list of his accomplishments that he really is a good economic historian. So I just want to say a couple of things before we get to the session. Since the founding of the SOMC in 1973, it's been strongly in favor of rules-based monetary policy instead of discretion. Back then, they talked about fine-tuning. And in the 1970s, Carl Brunner and Alan Meltzer, they urged the Fed to follow a monetary-based growth rule, and they adjusted that for feedback coming from the real economy and velocity. And Ben McCallum had a similar rule, which came a bit later. At each meeting, what they did was they announced ranges for the growth rate of the monetary base, and they wanted it to, this was during the Great Inflation, so they wanted it to reduce inflation. So if we just flash forward to today, in recent decades, the policy interest rate's the preferred instrument, and the model rule that people talk about all the time is the Taylor rule. But the principle of rules-based policy still prevails at the shadow. Also, another thing that's changed is that back then, central banks targeted monetary aggregates as intermediate instruments to hit their ultimate price and output goals. Today, they target inflation directly. And inflation targeting was highly successful in reducing inflation from above until the last decade. It was successful not only for advanced countries, but for emerging countries. Whereas now, there's a problem, as has been said, of hitting it from below. So with this very brief intro, I just wanted to raise a couple of questions for the panel, which will probably come up from others. Is the Fed's current conduct of monetary policy an appropriate blend of rules and discretion? And is there a problem that inflation has fallen shy of its 2% target? So the rules of this panel will be just like last time. Each speaker has 15 minutes. We'll start with Jim Bullard, and we'll allow one or two questions after his talk, and then we'll go to the other two people. Then we'll have a big Q&A at the end. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks for having me to this important event. I'm learning a lot, and it's fun to see a lot of familiar faces here. I titled my talk, How the World Achieved Partial Consensus on Monetary Policy, and you'll see the meaning of the title as we go through here. I do think there is one picture, so you might want to get your copy out at some point. In 2007, Marvin Goodfriend published a paper titled How the World Achieved Consensus on Monetary Policy in the Journal of Economic Perspectives. It is an excellent summary of the sequence of economic ideas influencing and eventually dominating actual monetary policy from Lucas, 1972, up to the eve of the global financial crisis. Goodfriend's explanations and summaries are so lucid and his examples and thinking so familiar to me that in rereading the article, I had the sensation that my life was flashing before my eyes. In the article, Goodfriend builds up the key idea in central banking of the last 50 years, namely that successful monetary policy requires a credible commitment on the part of the central bank to careful, systematic future policy choices. At the end of the article, he allows for some unfinished business and some open issues, among them the question of why credible central banks may end up with inflation that is too low when compared to an intended target. In retrospect, the World Consensus article appears a bit triumphal and somewhat premature. The events since its publication seem to suggest that the consensus that appeared to exist at that moment has its own problems. As we meet here today, many central banks have consistently missed their stated inflation targets to the low side for many years. Much sovereign debt traded in global markets today carries a negative nominal rate of return. Credibility of central banks, instead of improving over time based on the achievement of stated goals, seem to be eroding instead. The problem of how inflation can end up too low, in particular, does not seem to fit neatly into the proposed consensus framework. Accordingly, I have titled this talk, quote, "How the World Achieved Partial Consensus on Monetary Policy," end quote. One of the first and most practical issues in attempting to implement the consensus as outlined by Goodfriend is how a central bank might go about achieving the necessary credibility. One important and influential idea has been that the central bank can commit to a linear policy feedback rule such as the one suggested by Taylor in 1993. Taylor followed Friedmanian ideas on policy rules by insisting on a credible commitment to future central bank behavior. But unlike Friedman's K% money growth rule, a monetary rule of the Taylor type provides a complete state contingent map of how the monetary policymaker intends to set the policy instrument in all future states. The new classical synthesis model, Goodfriend and King, as well as its close relative, the new Keynesian model of Woodford, provided clearly worked out examples of DSG economies in which policy rules in the class suggested by Taylor provided high-quality business cycle stabilization. These models could be viewed very broadly as real business cycle economies with a sticky price friction. The goal of the monetary policymaker in this framework is to act to undo the effects of the sticky price friction in order to achieve the Wickselian natural real rate of interest, aka R star, aka the real rate of interest that would occur in the underlying frictionless real business cycle economy. As many investigations of models in this class were carried out, it gradually became clear that many different Taylor-type rules could be used to implement the optimal monetary policy. The World Consensus paper was published in 2007. Unfortunately, the years following its publication have not provided further consolidation of the consensus, but have instead weakened the consensus to some extent. Goodfriend cited the inflation outcomes in Japan from the mid-1990s to 2007 as a puzzle that required explanation. The core issue might be stated as follows. The Volcker disinflation and its global aftermath showed that central banks can control inflation over the medium term, and that central banks eventually came to understand the importance of a credible commitment to an inflation target. But if this is the case, why is it that major central banks since 2007 have missed their inflation targets on the low side for many years? Japan's puzzle, noted by Goodfriend, became more pervasive and less of an anomaly as time went on. This puzzle is important enough that we may want to consider backing off one or more of the key elements of the apparent consensus that Goodfriend identified. One idea is to swap out the sticky price friction and instead explore the implications of non-state contingent nominal contracting in credit markets, as in my paper with Ricardo DiCecchio last year, Optimal Monetary Policy for the Masses. This model could be viewed again as an underlying real business cycle economy, but now with a nominal contracting friction instead of a sticky price friction. The goal of monetary policy is, again, to undo the effects of the friction in order to achieve the Wickselian natural real rate of interest for the economy. And again, many different Taylor-type rules could be used to implement the optimal monetary policy. Actual inflation dynamics would depend on exactly which rule was used. The model features heterogeneous households and Gini coefficients close to those observed in the U.S. economy. The nominal contracting friction is a compelling one to study and has probably not received sufficient attention in the macroeconomics literature. Intuition suggests that nominal contracting in actual credit markets is rampant and that these markets can be very large. Nominal mortgage debt in the U.S., for instance, was about 16 trillion, that's trillion with a T, as of the third quarter of 2019. Dobke and Schneider in 2006 in the JPE argued that unexpected changes in inflation caused significant reallocation in the economy exactly because of massive nominal asset holding. Kevin Sheedy in the Brookings papers in 2014 constructed a model with both a sticky price friction and a nominal contracting friction and found that the nominal contracting friction was 9 times more important than the sticky price friction from the perspective of household welfare in the model. The essence of monetary policy, optimal monetary policy, in an economy with an important nominal contracting friction is fairly straightforward. You don't really need to go read the paper to get the intuition of that. Households have to sign ex-ante contracts in nominal terms in order to borrow and lend, and in simple versions of the model, they will agree on a nominal interest rate that is equal to the expected rate of nominal GDP growth. Shocks to the real growth rate of the economy will then occur, arising either from demand or supply. The policymaker then acts to set inflation such that the contracted nominal interest rate is equal to the actual ex post rate of nominal GDP growth. In other words, as in other models, commitment to act in this manner must be credible, and the credibility can be aided by a Taylor-type monetary policy rule that provides a map of monetary policy actions to be taken in each future state. The monetary policy rule is a way of ensuring that the monetary policymaker and the private sector jointly understand how monetary policy will be adjusted in the future in response to shocks to economic growth. Critically, the central bank has to be able to actually deliver the required amount of inflation ex post. Figure 1 provides an illustration of some of these ideas based on U.S. data over the last 15 years. The figure plots U.S. data on 5-year mortgage rates, which I will refer to as the contract rate, or RN, along with actual nominal GDP growth. The dark gray region on the left indicates a period when monetary policy was not executed well according to the principles of this model, and the light gray region on the right is a period when monetary policy came close to meeting the optimality condition. On the left side, the contract rate that we've picked out is from 2006, and it's 5.78% on that particular day. Subsequent nominal GDP growth, because of the crisis, was only 2.88%, so borrowers evidently did not have sufficient resources to pay off their nominal debts. The model predicts significant reallocation in this case, and that appears to be what happened during the period of the crisis. On the right side, the contract rate that we've picked out is 3.75%, while subsequent nominal GDP growth was not too far off at 3.99%. So the monetary policy in this case largely succeeded in converting the non-state contingent nominal contracts originally signed at the beginning of that particular period into the theoretically ideal state contingent real contracts that should have been used. The issue of low inflation around the world may come into clearer view in a model of this type. A critical feature of the optimal nominal GDP targeting policy is that the central bank can actually produce the required level of inflation ex post in response to real growth shocks. This figure, as well as our intuition, suggests that this was very difficult during the financial crisis years. If the private sector and monetary policymakers themselves begin to doubt policymaker ability to deliver promised inflation, the private sector agents will begin to contract on lower and lower nominal interest rates. Once these contracts are in place, the optimal policy is to deliver the associated lower level of nominal GDP growth and the associated lower rate of inflation. This dynamic could lead inflation to slide to low levels over time. The end result would be low nominal interest rate contracts, low nominal GDP growth, and low inflation, not too different from where we seem to be. Accordingly, theories leaning in this direction may provide a promising avenue for thinking about policymaker incentives for maintaining credibility in a low inflation world. Marvin Goodfriend was a brilliant economist who helped the profession make great strides on a critical social problem, inflation control, over the last 4 decades. His World Consensus paper lays out the deep ideas, many of which he contributed to personally, that formed the foundation of an apparent consensus on monetary policy that seemed to have developed by the eve of the global financial crisis. Subsequent global macroeconomic events have challenged that consensus. Our responsibility is to follow the example of Marvin Goodfriend's career and ethos to aggressively explore new ideas in order to forge a new consensus on monetary policy. Thanks very much.
We might take a couple of questions on Jim's paper before we move on.
Right, one guy here.
Okay.
Let me see.
No, I'm not taking one. I thought we'd just do one for Jim, just, yeah.
We
Okay.
have one here.
Yeah.
Okay, oh, there's one, okay.
Jim, nice paper. The piece about Japan and the Wixell reference were interesting. You read Wixell's 1898 paper, and he goes on to talk about first what we now look at as sort of the GDP gap approach, but then he goes on to talk about supply and demand. And when you look at Japan, we all teach in our courses that Volcker got a big boost from falling oil prices, but it was also the falling cost of Japanese electronics. And so now we're seeing that sort of spread around the world when we look at reasons for lower inflation through all durables, which started falling in price around 1995 in the G8. How does that play into these sort of revisions and looks at what's going on? Because a lot of this, Marvin really sort of teed up in papers years ago because of his empirical flavor.
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that technology prices are known to decline over time. Moore's law, continues to go unabated. I saw an article the other day that said maybe it's ending, but it's gone on for a long time, and this is becoming a bigger and bigger aspect of the macro economy. So you've got relative price decline for a sector or an important input into the economy, and that should be a factor that would come into play when you're trying to think about inflation control in the economy, but it's not one that I've seen convincingly put into play in the measurement of inflation.
Okay. I think what we'll do is we're going to go on, we'll do the other 2 papers, and we'll have an open Q&A session.
Thanks, Mike. I have a little paper that's in your packet. It's also posted on my website. And in it, there are more detailed references to, and in some cases, links to the references that I'll talk about in my short presentation today. In 2014, Marvin Goodfriend helped the Shadow Open Market Committee draft a statement of core beliefs. This is the document that Mickey referred to earlier today at the start. That document, which is available on our website, shadowfed.org, lists 7 basic principles to help guide the Fed as it conducts monetary and financial regulatory policies in the new post-crisis environment. 2 of the 7 principles listed pertain directly to the design of an effective monetary policy-making strategy. The first implicitly recognizes the importance of the Federal Open Market Committee's own 2012 announcement of an explicit 2% target for long-run inflation. But the second argues that by itself, the inflation target is not enough, and that the Fed's overall strategy is incomplete without an equally explicit plan for actually achieving that long-run goal as embodied in a specific monetary policy rule. Now, the idea that monetary policy works best when it's conducted according to simple pre-announced rules is, as Mike Bordeaux mentioned at the outset of this session, really one of the defining propositions of the SOMC and of monetarist economics more generally. And in some of his earlier work, Marvin detailed some of the arguments to support that monetarist proposition. His 1996 article from the Richmond Fed's annual report, which was republished a year later in the bank's Economic Quarterly, stands out in exactly that regard. In that paper, Marvin describes how, by making consistent reference to a monetary policy rule, FOMC members can help themselves resist the temptations that during the 1970s generated a destructive cycle of go-stop monetary policy making. Under go-stop, the FOMC would always wait until late in an economic expansion before beginning to raise interest rates. The problem was that by then, inflation was already on the rise. So aggressive monetary policy tightening would be needed just to bring inflation back down. And that same aggressive tightening would then send the economy back into a recession. In his paper, Marvin pointed out that by making consistent reference to a monetary policy rule, FOMC members would remind themselves that they need to begin raising rates earlier on in an expansion, modestly and gradually, but preemptively, the idea being to prevent inflation from rising in the first place, the goal being to allow the period of economic growth to continue as opposed to choking it off. In that same 1996 article, Marvin also pointed out that by making reference to a specific policy rule, FOMC members would also be able to remind themselves to ease monetary policy when changing macroeconomic circumstances, a slowdown in economic growth or especially inflation called for it. This was the point, too, that Greg Hess and President Charlie Evans were making earlier on today. And it's a point that I think needs to be re-emphasized because many critics of a rule-based approach to monetary policy making suggest that if the Fed were to adopt a specific monetary policy rule, the FOMC would always be fixated on keeping inflation low, ignoring developments for unemployment and output growth. But Marvin's point is actually to the contrary. Making reference to a specific monetary policy rule helps guide against errors on both sides, because even as it does indicate, yes, that monetary policy must tighten preemptively during an expansion, it also indicates just as clearly that the Fed needs to ease, again, when the economy is being hit by a series of deflationary, recessionary disturbances. So what more could the FOMC accomplish today if its members were willing to make more consistent reference to a monetary policy rule? To see, we can rely on some of the same arguments and ideas that Marvin brought up in his 1996 annual report article, but we don't have to go all the way back to the 1970s as he did for examples. We can simply reflect on the latest episodes, the very latest episodes in US monetary history extending back to 2018. So let's see. In 2018, we'll all recall, the FOMC was in tightening mode. They raised their target for the funds rate 4 times by a total of 1 percentage point. And because those moves came against the backdrop of accelerating economic growth and especially expectations that inflation was headed quickly back to the 2% target, those policy actions look very much like the preemptive moves to tighten policy during an expansion that Marvin described in his article. They were intended to prevent an overshoot of inflation above the 2% target and were undertaken with the idea of allowing the expansion to continue rather than choking it off. Now, late in 2018, something changed. In particular, immediately after the December 2018 FOMC meeting, where the last rate increase was put in place, U.S. financial markets experienced a bout of severe volatility that included, among other things, a 7.5% decline in the S&P 500 stock index that began precisely during Chair Powell's post-FOMC meeting press conference and continued for the next several trading days. Now, movements in stock prices are often hard to understand and interpret, even with the benefit of hindsight. But in this particular case, the timing of the decline in the stock market strongly suggests that. In December 2018, market participants saw that there was something wrong with, or at least something important missing from, the way the Fed was communicating its policy expectations to the public. In a recent working paper, Bob Hetzel, who's here today, suggests what I take to be the most likely explanation. It must have been that in December 2018, financial market participants believed that the Fed was going to continue tightening monetary policy throughout 2019. And perhaps thinking back to the stop phase of earlier Go Stop, they became convinced that the Fed would continue tightening until the economy fell back into a recession. Now, as Bob also points out in his paper, much to their credit, Chair Powell and other FOMC members worked hard in the early days of 2019 to calm the markets and to bring expectations back into line with their own. But my point would be that had the FOMC been making consistent reference to a policy rule all along, the disconnect between market expectations and the FOMC zone and the resulting market volatility, it might never have happened in the first place. Because as Marvin described in his 96 paper, even as a monetary policy rule says, yes, the Fed must tighten monetary policy preemptively during a robust expansion, it also indicates just as clearly that the Fed needs to lower interest rates to make monetary policy more accommodative when changing macroeconomic circumstances call for it. Now, in 2019, as a matter of fact, and again in dramatic fashion early this week, the FOMC did reverse course, completely undoing and more the 4 rate increases put in place during 2018. And again, those policy actions came against the backdrop of changing macroeconomic circumstances, a slowdown in global growth, which threatened to spread into the United States, and even more importantly, continuing disappointing news on the inflation front. Inflation had, as of 2018, been expected to return to target the following year. Instead, it's run persistently and noticeably below target. So why did the FOMC ease monetary policy 3 times last year and once again in dramatic fashion earlier this week? Was it because, as some critics have suggested, FOMC members felt themselves under political pressure to make monetary policy more inflationary? Well, we know that can't be right, because FOMC members are insulated from political pressures by various institutional features of the Fed's unique structure. Could it have been instead that FOMC members decided that they could use monetary policy to offset directly the effects of disruptions to trade, tariffs last year, and now the coronavirus? Well, we know that can't be right either, because FOMC members know, Chair Powell said this during his press conference earlier this week, there's nothing that monetary policy can do to directly offset the effects of barriers or disruptions to global trade. Instead, it must have been because FOMC members perceived that the U.S. economy has been buffeted by a series of adverse disturbances, which threaten to slow down and perhaps even derail our economic recovery, and more importantly, threaten to push inflation further and more persistently below target. My point is simply that that message could have been communicated much more clearly and much more easily with reference to a specific monetary policy rule. Now, for whatever reason, FOMC members have always resisted calls to take a more rules-based approach to describing their policy actions. But, as Marvin also emphasized in some of his writing and research, one of the great strengths of the Federal Reserve System comes from its decentralized structure. At Richmond, Marvin and President Al Broadus frequently proposed innovations to policy strategy that at first seemed radical, but gradually gained widespread acceptance as their usefulness became clear to all. Similarly, nothing today prevents a Reserve Bank president and/or his or her research director from blazing a trail, Broadus and Goodfriend style, this time by adopting a monetary policy rule of their own and making more consistent reference to it in their policy statements. Others on the committee will surely follow as the benefits to a rule-based approach to policy making become clear to all. Thank you.
So the title to my contribution to this panel is Rules, Boundaries, and a Credible Commitment to Price Stability. Marvin was a lifelong student of central banking, and this title is meant to summarize some of his great contributions. But he always had this aim of improving the Federal Reserve and how the Federal Reserve improves the performance of the economy. And similar to Jim's title, my title draws on Marvin's paper. In particular, in my case, in two papers. One is the last paper he wrote for the Shadow Open Market Committee in spring of 2017. It was a panel that Peter and I had Marvin in the middle in that panel, as I recall. There was a panel on strategies for sound monetary policy, and Marvin presented a wonderful short paper on the Fed needs a credible commitment to price stability, stressing some of the ideas that have already come up in the previous panel and earlier in this panel. But also another paper, one he wrote for the Fed Centennial, published in 2014. The title Marvin picked for that one was Lessons from a Century of Fed Policy, Why Monetary and Credit Policies Need to Be Rules, Need Rules and Boundaries, and stressing the need for that. Now, Marvin started his 2014 paper by noting that Congress established the Federal Reserve as an independent agency, which Marvin wanted to protect for the Fed. But he said that Congress established the Fed as an independent agency to improve our monetary system. And then he went on to note, quote, "We now know that faith then placed in discretion over rules was misplaced. The independence given the Fed to pursue discretionary policy in the public interest proved counterproductive. On the monetary policy side, in line with public and political pressures, the Fed's inclination to prioritize low unemployment over low inflation produced go-stop monetary policy after World War II that delivered neither, end quote. Of course, Marvin was optimistic about how the Fed could evolve in a way that would deliver on what Congress wanted the Fed to do with its mission, and this is what he was striving to do. Now, explaining why rules and boundaries could deliver better economic outcomes was a recurrent theme, and we've seen Peter actually highlight that as well in his remarks. Now, Marvin was consistently ahead of the curve. His explicit or implicit recommendations on policy strategy and communications, when adopted by the Fed years later, helped improve Fed policy. Marvin's paper on monetary mystique has already been mentioned, but it's pertinent to this panel as well, so I will also bring it up. This was in the 80s. Now, did it make sense that the Fed was hiding basic information from the public about how it operated, when it changed policy, why it changed policy, if it changed policy? I'm not going to talk about the Thanksgiving turkey episode. I know some of you will have memories of that you probably don't want to reinforce. Of course, we know the answer. Of course not. But it wasn't politically correct, let's put it like that, to discuss this. The published version of the paper uses language that is quite cautious and reserved. Marvin's conclusion, let me quote, "Given the inconclusiveness of the theoretical arguments and the presumption that government secrecy is inconsistent with the healthy functioning of a democracy, further work is required to demonstrate that central bank secrecy is socially beneficial," end quote. Of course, Marvin wrote the paper as a vice president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. Everybody knew that his views on secrecy would be controversial, and Marvin chose his words carefully to avoid crossing the gray line that would have left the paper unpublished. And I think he did a wonderful job. But he also used a very effective approach to express indirectly his thinking with a judicious quote by another lifelong student of central banking and one of the SOMC's founders, Carl Brunner. So the quote was an important part of Marvin's introduction. So let me actually read you how Marvin used Carl Brunner's words to tell us what he really thought about what the Fed was doing. So this is, quote, "The political mystique of central banking was, and still to some extent, widely expressed by an essentially metaphysical approach to monetary affairs and monetary policy making. The possession of wisdom, perception, and relevant knowledge is naturally attributed to the management of central banks. The possession of such knowledge and perception bearing on matters of concern of central banking is a function of the political position. The relevant knowledge seems automatically obtained with the appointment and could only be manifested to holders of the appropriate position. The mystique thrives on a pervasive impression that central banking is an esoteric art. Access to this art and its proper execution is confined to the initiated elite. The esoteric nature of the art is moreover revealed by an inherent impossibility to articulate its insights in explicit or intelligible words and sentences. Communication with the uninitiated breaks down. The proper attitude to be cultivated by the latter is trust and confidence in the initiated group's comprehension of the esoteric knowledge." And this, I think, reflected much better what Marvin's thoughts were about how the Fed was operating, but actually using Carl's words made the paper publishable and actually helped improve Fed policy down the road. Now, by the early 90s, just a few years after Marvin's paper, it was clear that he had won the argument. The Fed started on a path of greater and greater transparency. From 1994 on, the Fed would announce policy moves and then discussion on adding clarity on the Fed's goals and strategy. I think it's great that we have Don Kohn with us today, the secretary of the committee in those years of where transparency went from here to way up there. Exactly. A little bit more than I would have done, but that's a different debate. That's a different debate. Again, those dots. Marvin kept pushing for more. More important, a clear commitment to price stability. His 1993 paper on inflation scares is one I believe was particularly important, and it influenced quite a bit of work, including my work with John Williams on the topic. Now, let me just remind you that for a very long time, the Fed refused to provide a clear definition of price stability, using its discretion to vary the meaning of price stability in its mandate. Now, Fed is not the only central bank. We have another very large central bank that even today is doing something similar. But let me remind you those old days. Sometimes Fed officials would even refer to the Fed's approach to price stability as, quote, opportunistic. Now, certainly that's not the best way to express a credible commitment to price stability, which is what Marvin was pushing for. And using historical analysis and theoretical arguments in his 1993 paper, Marvin explained that this lack of clarity was costly to the economy. Failure to stick to a credible definition of price stability created inflation scares, a wonderful expression to focus the mind for monetary policymakers. And this was forcing the Fed to occasionally raise real interest rates with potentially depressing effects on the economy that wouldn't be necessary if the Fed had a clear commitment. In Marvin's view, better economic outcomes were feasible. They could be achieved with a stronger commitment to price stability. Now, sometimes statements like this are misinterpreted as lack of care about real economic stability, a point that Peter made, came up in Don's discussion earlier on. I would say that this actually is the opposite is true. And Marvin explained that in the conclusion of his 1993 paper already. So let me quote that conclusion. Quote, the preceding observations suggest an attractive argument in favor of a congressional mandate for price stability. By reducing the risk of inflation scares, such a mandate would free the funds rate to react more aggressively to unemployment in the short run. Thus, a mandate for price stability would not only help eliminate inefficiencies associated with long-run inflation, it would add flexibility to the funds rate that might improve counter-cyclical stabilization policy as well, end quote. It's in this line of work that convinced Marvin to become a proponent of the Fed adopting an inflation target as a means to help the Fed improve its ability to implement effective counter-cyclical policy. Of course, in parallel with that, he was doing theoretical work. For example, the work with Bob King that was presenting the theoretical case for the argument. And once again, Marvin won the argument. Within a decade of his inflation scares paper, in January of 2012, the FOMC put out the now familiar statement on policy goals and strategy that was already extensively discussed in the previous panel, and adopted a 2% symmetric inflation goal as its definition of price stability. But more could be done. So while Marvin praised the 2012 statement, he also saw it as incomplete. In his last SOMC paper in spring of 2017, he called it, quote, a good first start, end quote. Again, part of this was discussed in the previous panel, but it pertains to the same discussion. So how could the Fed's policy strategy and communication improve? Let me quote the conclusion of his 2017 paper. Finally, the FOMC should declare its intention in the statement to invite the legislature to accept the inflation target to further enhance its credibility. And the FOMC should declare its intention to strengthen the legislative oversight process to help enforce the systematic pursuit of monetary policy. That is the period-by-period mitigation of fluctuations of inflation around its 2% target, while keeping employment close to a sustainable level over time. To do so, the Fed should include in the statement its intention to improve legislative oversight by presenting the FOMC's independently chosen monetary policy decisions against a familiar Taylor-type reference rule for monetary policy, end quote. In other words, what he was arguing is that the FOMC still needs to do much more to explain its strategy along the lines of what Peter brought up. Now, let me end by touching bases with the title of our conference today. Remember, this is Current Monetary Policy, the Influence of Marvin Goodfriend. So just very briefly, a remark on the latest FOMC action. A surprise 50 basis points cut in the policy rate, a cut that was apparently so urgent that it could not wait for the regularly scheduled FOMC meeting 2 weeks later, when it was expected, and when it could have been accompanied with the committee's revised summary of economic projections and additional information, and hopefully with added elements in light of the discussion we had in the previous panel. So what was the Fed's communication of its strategy? Well, I've been quoting all day, so let me read from Tuesday's press release, quote, "The committee is closely monitoring developing and their implications for the economic outlook and will use its tools and act as appropriate to support the economy," end quote. So what's the strategy? Act as appropriate. So I would close by saying that this is one part of Marvin's agenda to improve the Fed that has not yet been completed. Don Kohn used the similar words earlier on in a different context. But of course, the FOMC is currently discussing how to improve its strategy and its communication. I hope the outcome of this discussion folds in more of Marvin's wisdom. Doing so would make the Fed a better central bank. Thank you.
We have some time for questions. I think, yeah, was that?
Hi, I'm Doug Carr, and great panel, and overall a great meeting that you all are having today. A quick note on Marvin. He was very welcoming to those of us attending your meetings, and certainly missed in that regard. On the subject of policy rules, isn't it key in this environment where central banks really haven't had any influence on the inflation rate that they get the target right? If you look at the last 25 years of US experience, there's no trend to 2% inflation. It's flat. There's only one period when we were at anything approaching a symmetrical 2% target. That was the run-up to the financial crisis. So the economy is doing better with 1.5% inflation, which is what the San Francisco Fed recently said was the pre-crisis informal target of the Fed. We're doing better with 1.5% inflation than 2% inflation. So when you can't influence the inflation rate, hadn't you better have a target that's accurate and good for the economy?
Okay, who wants to ask us?
Well, let me just briefly suggest that I disagree with the premise that monetary policy has not been able to influence inflation. We need to examine the counterfactuals of had the Fed not massively eased policy during the great financial crisis, inflation would have been much lower. So it's the fact that policy did respond to the outlook for inflation that kept it as stable as it has been. And I would say that using other central banks at the ECB, they've done some very interesting counterfactuals saying that had the ECB not implemented QE just in the last 4 years, inflation would have continued to fall even further in their case. Again, the stability of inflation in the Fed's case is a good outcome. And the Fed did relatively better than some other central banks in this regard, and I think it deserves credit. It could do even better, but I think it's appropriate to give credit for the good outcomes.
Okay. So this would be the declare success strategy, which is just if inflation's low, then just lower your target. I think that would disturb the whole idea behind it, which is to get credibility. When we were thinking about a number to name, I advocated 1.5%. I remember talking to Charlie Plosser, not to put words in his mouth, but he was for a lower rate. And I remember talking to him and Charlie, shouldn't we be advocating for 1.5? And he said, look, I'm just happy to get a number. So I think 2%, let's face it, has become an international standard. And I think for the major economies, that's a tremendous success. You would like all the major economies to basically have the same inflation target and not be moving them around. I think to change the target in this environment or any environment, especially for the U.S., would set off a chain reaction around the world, and other countries would then change their targets or do something, and then you'd be back to a more volatile environment. I would also say that overall the inflation targeting writ large has been crazy successful. The U.S. hit 2% inflation in about 1995 and averaged 2% inflation basically right through the crisis all the way up to 2012. It's only since 2012 that we've fallen off that price level path and not had the 2% inflation. So I think it is an issue as to why we're too low, but I think the 2% target's international standard that should be stuck to. Also, and finally, if you're going to name a target, name it and then hit it, because it's all about the credibility, I think.
Yeah, well, if I could just add one final point, because your question, Doug, dovetails nicely with the one that was asked right after Jim's presentation. Clearly, measured inflation is influenced, it seems, even over intermediate horizons by non-monetary as well as monetary factors. And one response to that, I talk a little bit about this in my paper. This, I think, is consistent with Marvin's sentiments as well, might be to say, well, let's have a major rethink. Milton Friedman, in fact, rejected inflation targeting for precisely that reason. By the time monetary policy has a reliable effect, it's too late. The Fed needs to do something else, and it's still stuck, with fighting the last battle. That's why he preferred a constant money growth rate rule. There are more ambitious alternatives to that, like Ben McCallum's rule that focuses on the monetary base but gradually adjusts it in response to changes in the economy in a way that achieves modest stabilization objectives as well. In the end, however, I know it's trendy to say this these days. I sort of have Burkean tendencies for some of the same reasons perhaps that Jim does. I mean, the Fed already took a huge step forward by naming the 2% inflation target. The FOMC for decades has been playing this game of managing interest rates actively in response to changes in unemployment and changes in inflation so as to stabilize prices but also achieve modest stabilization objectives. So while I'm always happy to consider theoretical alternatives, my suspicion of utopian proposals more generally makes me say, look, if you're going to play this game, at least impose the intertemporal discipline by making more consistent reference to a rule.
Andy, and then I'll.
That's great. I think a critical part of the credibility of the inflation target is not just the people who are in favor of it today, but the confidence that the committee is going to continue to foster that same objective over an extended period, knowing that members of the committee rotate over time. for various reasons, terms of office and retirements. So the remarkable thing in 2012 was that after 20 years of trying to achieve a broad consensus on the committee, they were able, and this was credit Ben Bernanke's leadership and Janet Yellen and Charlie Plosser, who helped foster consensus among the presidents. Charlie Evans, I remember, and Loretta was involved, at that time as a research director. It took a lot of work to get pretty much unanimous consent to the 2% target. Now, you have to remember the background of this was Alan Greenspan wanted to shoot for something more like 1%, or kind of zero properly measured. Bernanke talked about a comfort zone of 1 to 2%, which sort of, at which point Alan Greenspan's view was kind of at the lower end. Then they moved to starting to publish individual assessments of the preferred individual participants' preferred longer run inflation goal, what they thought was appropriate. And that was 1.5 to 2. Charlie Plosser was willing to settle for 1 3/4, but there were quite a few people who thought 2 was the right number, and then everyone else said, okay, look, that's fine, let's pick a number and stick with it. So there is a history here of how that consensus was built, and again, I think you want credibility the way that Bob King talked about earlier today. You got to be very careful here to not just start making arbitrary fiddling with the number.
Okay.
From a layman's point of view, what it feels like is that the Fed has changed the definition of inflation. The number itself has got different components in it than it might have had 30 years ago. There seems to be a double standard in inflation. Everything I buy seems to get more expensive. And I think that's the general fact in this room, that the things we're actually buying cost more. And so we're facing inflation, but the basic targets as described by the Fed have no inflation in it. And I'm not sure why that is or why it should be.
Does someone want to get that?
I can talk measurement if you want. I think measuring inflation is actually quite, and building up a price level index, really hard problem, actually, if you get into it. Matching up the economics with the data, thinking about trends and relative prices, updating the basket of goods over time, updating the quality measures over time. Wow. You start to put all that together, and it really gets pretty hairy. So there is a sort of false precision, I think, we do the best we can, and we do it in a standard way, so that's helpful, but there is a bit of a false precision. A couple places where this is showing up, the committee likes the personal consumption expenditures index, and it likes the core measure there, where you're throwing out food and energy. I think that's way outdated. I think we should update that, but okay. You've got this Dallas Fed trim mean idea, which is a more sophisticated statistical approach. You could go in that direction. You also got this issue, if you compare Europe to the US, the Europeans did not put owners' occupied rent into the price index because they felt it wasn't consistent enough across countries. And so they use the HICP, which doesn't have that in it. Well, that's a huge component. So when you're looking at inflation in the US versus inflation in Europe, you're comparing kind of apples and oranges. And so that's a place where there isn't the proper international standard. Now, there is some talk that they might change that now, which would actually increase their measured inflation rate somewhat. So these issues become particularly important when you're talking about a 2% inflation target and you're talking about 0.1%, deviation. I think we should all keep in mind that there's a lot of measurement uncertainty around inflation measures. So, I don't know.
Could it not be that we actually are at 2%?
Well, if you, like I say, now Another approach would be the Arthur Burns approach, where you come in to the congressional hearing and you present, here are 6 different measures of inflation. Some are higher, some are lower, so I'm pretty good on average. You could do that. The committee has not, taking that kind of approach, I think, conflicts with the idea of credibility, because that would blur up which measure of inflation do you want to commit to, and which measure of inflation do you want to stabilize. So the committee's strategy, as I've interpreted it anyway, has been, yes, there are measurement issues, yes, they're difficult, we're going to still plow ahead, choose a measure that we like best, and then we're going to try to get 2% on that particular measure and let the other measures go wherever they're going to go.
Okay. Yeah. Mickey, and then back there after you.
Before I ask my question, I want to make a comment on the last question. The Fed does not make clear that it does not calculate inflation. Inflation is calculated by the Bureau of Economic Analysis and the Department of Commerce, and it takes nominal measures and then applies to the price changes quality adjustment, and it uses a lot of hedonic regression analyses, and however accurate it tries to be, there is still some subjectivity. The Fed merely takes the inflation measures and then deliberates on them. So I think this is a misperception in the market and in the public that it's not the Fed that's calculating inflation. Okay, so Jim, here's my question. In your paper, you refer a fair amount to nominal GDP, I think appropriately so, and in your chart, you show that during the financial crisis, nominal GDP fell sharply, and you identified that as bad policy outcome. And so here I want to come to where we are right now, and back then it was a financial crisis that generated the bad policy outcome or the bad outcome of a decline in nominal GDP that was associated with a deep recession. And now what we face now is a real shock rather than a financial shock. And so if you're rules-based and presumably the current real shock you're in is temporary, somehow defined, how do you abide by rules when you have a shock that is not financial, not maybe that it's a real shock?
Yeah, the theory is really clear. There would be shocks to real GDP growth that could come from lots of different sources. The policymaker, maybe a heroic assumption, gets to observe these shocks and then has to provide enough inflation to offset them ex post. That's the idea of nominal GDP targeting. So what would happen is you go into recession, that's the period where you would have more inflation right at that juncture. And then subsequent to that, people would start contracting differently and you would adjust policy differently. But the hallmark is that if you get a bad shock, you'd have high inflation. And if you get a good shock, you'd have low inflation. So that's because you're stabilizing nominal GDP, and that actually works perfectly inside the model because it makes it that the true interest rate is state contingent and is based on real things. So that's exactly what you would want. You've got creditors and borrowers, lenders and borrowers in the model. You want to balance those guys and get just the right interest rate, even though the world is uncertain and even though you've got shocks to growth, and this would do exactly that. So I think it's a good way to think about what we're trying to do. It's not one that has not been explored as much as the sticky price friction, but I think, frankly, we're crazy overcommitted to the sticky price world. I've used it myself, I've published myself, but there are other nominal frictions that you might want to think about, and they might help you to think a little bit differently about what monetary policy can do best.
Okay. Okay, there's a question. Oh, yeah, sorry, that guy back there first, and then you.
Hi, Ivan Lengwieler from University of Basel. I think we all agree that an inflation target is important, has been very successful. On the level of the inflation target, I think we should also consider that the central bank needs some space around the implied nominal interest rate, because for cyclical reasons you need to go up and down. And if there is a zero lower bound and we don't want to go below that, it's important to be sufficiently above that on average, right? Now, if it is true that our star has been declining over 2 decades or whatever, is an inflation target of 2% still correct? I mean, if our star is maybe 0.5% or 0%, that doesn't give very much room to maneuver for the central banks.
Right. Well, it's certainly true that, as Jim said, that the 2% inflation target didn't come out of nowhere. It emerged out of years, maybe even decades of economic research. It's not based on one specific model, but a body of research that looks at the costs of having a higher inflation rate versus the benefits, let's say. One argument is downward nominal rigidity in wages. Another argument for a higher inflation target is to leave room for the zero lower bound. I don't think it's unreasonable, even if you are interested in preserving continuity and credibility of the process, to say that the Fed, like the Bank of Canada does already, will periodically revisit the target and if it's appropriate, raise the target to whatever, 2.5 or 3. However, what I would point out on the other side are 2 things. Number one, people have to remember that there are costs of ongoing inflation, and in the same body of research that suggested that we needed 2% to allow a little bit of room to ease it, given that there's a zero lower bound. I mean, that same body of research also pointed to significant costs to, even inflation rates on the order of 3%, ongoing inflation rates of 3 to 4% per year. So my point would be, it's fine to reconsider, but one must be careful to reconsider both sides. And then the second point that I would make is that argument attaching so much weight to the zero lower bound assumes implicitly, or it at least runs the risk of assuming implicitly, that the only channel through which monetary policy affects the economy is via the setting of the federal funds rate. So to the extent that forward guidance shapes expectations and affects longer-term rates and succeeds at delivering additional monetary accommodation, or to the extent that quantitative easing, large-scale asset purchases can have impact on expected inflation that helps too, when the funds rate is constrained by a zero lower bound, weakens that argument. That's just a long-winded way of saying I concede that you have a point, but I think it's important to consider the costs as well as the benefits of raising the inflation target.
But I would add that there are considerable costs to even entertain the suggestion that every few years this question will be revisited. And one of the things Marvin Goodfriend was trying to focus on.
It's fighting against the whole idea of trying to get
no.
Yeah.
You keep it there so that what you're trying to anchor. I mean, Marvin would used to talk about 30-year bonds, not 10-year bonds, 30-year bonds. And the whole point of the discussion is fix something so that you eliminate those unnecessary and destructive premia and the uncertainty associated with them. So maybe 2% is not the perfect number for all of the reasons that Peter just explained. It still makes sense, considering how costly it is to even entertain the notion of keep redefining these things or keep examining it, to stop the discussion once we have, after many decades of research and deliberation, something that's good enough. So this reminds me of how Ben Bernanke presented it when he was trying to convince the committee as a governor. He had a speech said, well, there is something, let's call it OLIR, the optimal long-term inflation rate. It's something. Whatever it is, find it, stick to it. That's pretty much the philosophy I think that would be useful to follow.
Yeah, I would just put a plug in for there is some chatter around that the 2% target came out of nowhere and no one ever thought about it, but there was a very extensive welfare cost of inflation literature, especially in the 90s, especially during the run-up to the founding of the ECB. And of course, inflation targeting ideas were became very popular in the 1990s. So it was really that era. And there are many papers. I'm thinking of Dotsie in Ireland, JME, I think, but there's a long list of papers that looked at this. Lucas 2000, and I think that literature is probably less popular today than it was. But there was a lot of great work done on the welfare cost of inflation and why you didn't want to go too high. So you have to balance off the idea that you don't want to go too high because of the welfare cost of inflation, but you might not want to go too low because of issues about the zero bound. So you have to trade those off. I believe Jordi Gali has a paper that trades those off. I saw the paper. I saw him present the paper, and the answer was 2%.
I want to jump in favor of that comment back there. So the Bank of Canada has every 10 years, they revisit the issue. There's nothing wrong with that. They do it, and it's not that they're threatening their credibility. They do it. They say, look, they look at all these costs and the benefits. And originally, like 15 years ago, I did some consulting for them. They were thinking of having price level targeting, okay? And for various reasons, they decided not to do it. But there's still a good reason why they should have done it. So why should we say, well, okay, we're stuck with this 2% now, and we can't ever do better?
I think it's great to have the review. I think it is appropriate. You would think, you get 50 years down the line or 250 years down the line, you probably don't want to have exactly the same framework. And so for that reason, I do think it's good, but it should be carefully done, and you would change things only with very good reasons that you think will persist far into the future from that point on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry.
Steve Leisman, CNBC. I think we find ourselves now where we often are when there's a shock to the economy, which is wondering what the right mix is of response from the monetary and the fiscal authority. I was wondering if President Bullard and other members of the panel might respond to what they think that right mix ought to be right now, whether or not there's a difference when the Federal Reserve is closer to the zero lower bound, and finally, whether it makes sense to, at a quieter time, establish some principles about how it ought to act relative to the fiscal authority when there are shocks to the economy.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the optimal response here is a public health response, and so that's really where you want to put almost all your energy here. If we can get control of the virus and put this behind us, everything will return to the very strong economy that we've had so far this year. And today's jobs report says it was, still very, very good as of early February. And this public health response is not just any one person. It's a net of responses across a wide variety of organizations and entities all across the country, right down to the individual families, taking into account their own health and worrying about their own health, but you've got entities, corporations making important adjustments, schools, all kinds of thinking going on, and it's that net response of the whole society that will bring the virus under control eventually, and then the disruptions that are occurring will abate, and the economy will recover. I think we'll have a slowdown for a while. It's unclear right now how severe it'll be, but I'm pretty confident that we'll do better than China. China was hit by this and not knowing what it was, and then had to play catch up. We knew a little bit about it before it got here to the United States, and I think our public health response will be given this net effect and all 330 million people doing something about it. I think the net effect will be pretty good. And then we'll be able to recover from there. There are going to be ripples and disruptions. Another thing I would point out about this is a lot of corporate entities and other kinds of organizations, they have contingency plans. They have crisis management plans of various kinds and they think about this kind of thing, including my bank. We sit around at management committee and think about, okay, how would we handle that? What can we do? How can we mitigate our risk? How can we make sure we can get our work done in the right way? So I think those kinds of things are going on all over the society and all over the world. But I think markets seem to be pricing in the very worst outcome here, and I'm not quite sure that's warranted given the kind of response that I'm describing.
Yes, I mean, I think that your question is a good one. The latest circumstance is an example, doesn't quite make the point as vividly as it could, because clearly in this case, what we all really want is confidence that that the healthcare system is ready to cope with this, and that local authorities are ready to help us with any disruptions to schools or to work and so on. But let me go back to the more general theme of the usefulness of a policy rule. Another thought experiment which highlights the danger more vividly would be, suppose that after all of this is done, the deficit continues to grow, and we get to the point where there is a crisis, a problem with rolling over short-term debt or long-term rates spiking sharply higher. Will the Fed, under those circumstances, be pressured to basically create money in order to deal with that crisis? What I see, I don't have any fault with the particular response earlier this week, but what causes concern for me when I see the response this time, and to the tariffs, and to what happened in December 2018, okay, I understand it's a tough job for Chair Powell, politically and economically. But if I had to offer constructive criticism, what I would say, it kind of looks like you're careening from crisis to crisis. You manage one problem when it comes up, the next problem when it comes up, and you don't really have a longer-term plan. So what could be gained from referring to a monetary policy rule would be to say, we have the 2% inflation target. It's a symmetric target. We made that clear. Monetary policy must be conducted at all times to support that 2% target. I mean, will that solve the fiscal monetary showdown if and when it finally occurs? Who knows? But if you're asking what could the Fed do now, I think what it could do now is to make clearer to the public that it's not just a series of one-off responses to one-off problems. It's a consistent plan to conduct policy in a way that supports long-run price stability.
Let me just add one element on the fiscal monetary policy mix. I think it is important, more important now in a low R-star world than in a higher R-star world, to realize that you get better economic outcomes if you have good policy rules on the monetary policy side and good policy rules on the fiscal side, and that fiscal policy does help also with stabilizing business cycle and can help monetary policy when you're facing with the zero alert bound. So it's important to bring this into the discussion. The way I would do this is by encouraging that we think about better fiscal policy rules, much like over the past several decades we have been thinking about better monetary policy rules. And I think this is happening more in the United States than elsewhere. I mean, I recall when I was in Europe in the middle of the crisis 10 years ago, for example, one of the problems in retrospect with the ECB monetary policy is that it refused to touch bases at all with the role of fiscal policy for handling the recession that came after the global financial crisis. And I think that ended up being counterproductive. I think in the US, the Fed handled this better, but we can improve things by reinforcing the usefulness of improving fiscal as well as monetary policy rules.
Okay, listen, Bob King, last question.
So I want to follow up on what I thought was a very good question, and I want to pose it in a particular way to the presenters. Earlier this week, Larry Summers in the Washington Post wrote an article in which he reviewed the kind of health circumstances and advocated for increased spending, careful planning, et cetera, things we would all agree with. He also said the 50 basis point drop, wasn't sure what the effect would be, but what the heck, why not go ahead and do it anyway? But the critical part of Larry's article was that he suggested that it would be important for the Fed to construct a facility for providing credit, perhaps principally for small businesses that were affected by a recession induced by the coronavirus. Now, we can think about the answer to the question that was posed before in the following way. If we want to deal with those problems, should we appoint Larry Summers to be the head of the Fed, and have the Fed open the credit facility, or should we appoint Larry Summers to be the Secretary of Treasury and have the Treasury open the facility? I think Marvin, in his work and in a series of papers written at the Richmond Fed, Charlie Plosser and others would say, this is fiscal policy, let's put it into Treasury. Right. So can I have a reaction about the boundaries between monetary and fiscal policy?
So, I would agree with you. I think you'd have a lot of agreement in this room that that's definitely fiscal policy. And if Congress wants to go ahead and support small business with a congressionally approved program, they're welcome to do that. And they actually do that. They have many programs in various ways that reach out to smaller businesses. SBA is one that I can think of, but there are many others. And so this, if you think that this is an important issue, this might be the time that you'd want to beef up those particular programs. And Congress is, did vote on a package, to try to address the crisis. So. Yeah, I think you want to keep monetary policy focused on the task at hand and keep us in our lane.
Okay.
Well, I guess my response would be, this I think is what Marvin would say. I think unfortunately a lot of people today, and probably always, are confused about the economic role played by a central bank in a capitalist economy. The economic role is to manage the stock of base money in order to pin down the aggregate nominal price level. And that's a role that no other the Fed, the central bank, is our answer to the coordination problem of how to determine the overall level of prices in the economy. Unfortunately, many people think of the central bank as a kind of government-owned financial intermediary that instead accepts deposits. It especially looks like that now, given the Fed's ability to pay interest on reserves, and then makes loans. And so it becomes natural to think, well, if the private sector can no longer do that efficiently, then, well, that's what the Fed is there for. I guess what I would say is I'm a little bit disappointed in Larry Summers contributing to that confusion. I would be perfect, if, I think this is the point you were suggesting, if instead he had said Congress in association with the Treasury might think of ways of easing credit conditions for small businesses in the event that this turns out to be, a severe credit-based recession, then we say, well, fine, that's fiscal policy, and in our democracy, that's what we elect Congress and the Senate to decide on.
So let me just add briefly to what Peter said. In my view, which I believe lines up with Marvin's views that you know better than I do, is that the Federal Reserve should avoid unnecessary distributional effects of its policies. Monetary policy, even plain monetary policy, has some distributional effects that are unavoidable. But why go beyond that? And this has a lot of implications about credit policy. It has implications about asset purchases. In past SOMC meetings a few years ago, we were discussing about where it was a good idea for the Fed to engage in anything other than purchases of treasury bonds when it did quantitative easing. In my view, and I think Marvin agreed with that as well, is that it would be better to just buy treasuries and then let the Treasury decide how to use the money. And if the government decides to support sector X or sector Y, this is not the central bank's job.
Okay. I think we're going to end this session. We have lunch in the other room, and then we're coming back at 11:45 to hear, 12:45 to hear Al. Thank you.